If you spend enough time in this sport, you'll know that damn near every time you compete, you're going to be looking at a different rule set. And it gets really annoying trying to understand the different nuances to all these different rule sets. And for the most part, I think these organizations are just trying their best to find the best athlete and put on an exciting match in the process. But the absolute worst attempt at any of these rule sets is submission only. Okay, before you put your Cheeto fingers on that keyboard to write a hate comment, let me caveat this a little bit. Submission only with no time limit is hands down the best way to figure out who the better person is. There's just no question about it. But there's a couple problems with this rule set. Okay. Let's start with entertainment value. Now, like I said, this is the best way to figure out who the better person is. You put both people in, one person comes out on top, they're the better person. It's really simple. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is this rule set completely ignores the question of how do we make jiu-jitsu exciting? I've been doing this for 14 years. I love the sport. I break these things down, but there's no way in hell I'm sitting through 2 hours of stalemates to figure out who the better person is. It's just not happening. And if we're being real, that's what you're asking for if you want no time submission only matches. When you have two guys at the highest level of the sport, sometimes the right move is to not move for extended periods of time. So sure, you always get the result of a submission, but you're gonna see way longer stalemates. Now, I'm of the opinion that jiu-jitsu isn't a spectator sport. We don't need to be tailoring the game around what uneducated fans want, because 90% of these people just wanna see fast movement and something that catches their eye, and they don't understand the steps that you actually have to take to get to the submission. There is another side to that coin. Jiu-jitsu does need spectators, and it needs spectators that see enough value in the sport that they're willing to pay to watch it. If we don't have that, we're relying on either the athletes to pay to fund these tournaments, or we're relying on some rich person to fund these tournaments. And either way, that's not really feasible. The other problem is the logistics of it. It would be impossible to manage a large-scale tournament with no time limit matches, at least in the way the IBJJF does, and there's a reason why anytime someone's tried it, it's been a complete disaster or the event no longer exists. Now, I'm not making this to critique no-time submission-only matches. Like I said, if we're just trying to figure out who the better person is, that's the best way to do it. You know, we all want to LARP as warriors fighting to the death out there.
That's this! Okay.
I just don't think it works for the tournament setting. Before we talk about my issues with the time submission only rule set, let me quickly go over some of the common rule sets we use just so we can make a fair comparison. We'll start with everyone's favorite, the IBJJF. Now, IBJJF is your point-based rule set, so you get 2 points for takedowns and sweeps, 3 points for passing the guard, you get 4 points for mount and back, and you also get 2 points for knee on belly, but for what we're comparing today, you can kind of ignore that one. Now, you also get advantages on top of those, so advantages come from almost completing one of those positions or almost submitting your opponent, but the advantages only matter in the case of a tie. So if the points are tied at the end of the match, they go to the advantages, the person with the most advantages wins the match. ADCC is sort of a hybrid rule set where you have no points the first half and then points go active the last half. Now, I like this rule set a lot in theory, but it has its own problems. You could get positionally dominated for the whole first half of the match, and then if you're able to score in the last half, now you have a smaller window to ride out a stall if that's where your mindset is. And it can suck for the other person because if you're working for a submission for the whole first half of the match while the other person's stalling, once the points go active, they've spent less energy, so now it's easier for them to score and ride out the rest of the clock. So there's always trade-offs. You also have your EBI rule set where you have a time submission only match with no scoring, and if no one gets a submission at the end, you go to overtime where each person gets to start in a dominant position and the person with either the fastest escape times or the fastest submit times wins. Again, it sounds great in theory, but this rule set has caused some of the most boring stall fests we've ever seen in the sport, and I think it's really bad for our fundamentals. When you give someone a dominant position they couldn't otherwise achieve, it encourages them to just wait for that dominant position, which in turn encourages them to skip all these in-between steps that you have to understand to achieve these dominant positions. If you remember, Chad Mendez submitted Jeff Glover under this rule set. That is an absolute travesty, and I won't stand for it. On to the dark brown stain on this sport that is time submission only matches. This would be your fight to win or who's number one style rules. Now, I like a lot of what who's number one's doing, but I do see some problems I want to talk about later in the video. I want to direct this part mainly at just fight to win. So at the fight to win rules meetings, they'll tell you that submission attempts and slams are the only thing that's scored. Position doesn't matter whatsoever. Now again, in theory, this rule set sounds like the best of all of them. You go for submissions, you win. Well, what's the problem? The problem with this rule set, and any rule set in any sport, is the best athletes are always going to try to find the easiest path to victory. They're always going to try to play the rules, and that's the smart thing to do. At the end of the day, we're all just trying to find the most consistent way to win these matches, so that's what we need to take into account. So what would be the easiest path to victory in a fight to win match? One pops into my head immediately, and that's getting a safe position, attacking one submission, and then running the clock out. This is the classic IBJJF stall tactic that everyone's hated for years, but for some reason when it's a different organization, everyone closes their eyes and pretends it's not happening. The difference here is IBJJF has made adjustments to their rules over the years to make sure that this type of thing doesn't happen. Now let's take the IBJJF. What would be the easiest path to victory under IBJJF? I think everyone watching would agree it's scoring an advantage and then running the clock out. Now these strategies sound similar, but what's the difference? The difference is the classification for what you're scoring for. In Fight to Win, you're scoring for submission attempts. In IBJJF, you're scoring for almost completing the submission. Sounds close, but it's a really important distinction to make. It's the difference between sitting up, reaching for a Kimura and losing it, or sitting up, reaching through, grabbing your wrist, and starting to move their arm behind their back before you lose it. It's a big, big difference to me. At its core, Jiu Jitsu is all about getting the submission, but an understanding of the path you need to take to get there is very important. If you go to a Fight to Win match, you'll see people flailing for submissions, and sure, sometimes they work, but I'd argue most of these people are hugely mismatched because that's how you put on exciting shows. I mean, I have a Fight to Win belt sitting behind me. How else am I going to win a Fight to Win belt if my opponent isn't a giant mismatch? Now, when you get up to the main card and you have better matched black belts, you almost always see these matches play out in a similar way to an IBJJF finals. People are edging out victories. Most of them aren't submitting each other because everyone has great defense at that level, and it's very hard to submit another really good black belt. So the way to win is you edge out a victory, right? It just is what it is. It turns into points without points. And when you have a stalemate like this where two guys can't submit each other, you need to have a way to decide this match, right? IBJJF has the point system, so when people can't submit each other, you go to who had better positional control. Well, in Fight to Win, they don't have a criteria to decide who had better positional control. So when there's no submission attempts in the match, it goes into the hands of these three local judges who are just arbitrarily trying to decide the fate of this match. And that sort of brings me to my only problem I have with who's number one. Now, they've addressed a lot of the critiques I have for Fight to Win. They reward for legitimate submission attempts and they reward for aggression. But at the end of the match, it still goes into the hands of three judges, and aggression is sort of arbitrary. You're giving these judges a lot of power to decide what that means. They say they rely on 3 neutral side judges to decide this, but I'd argue that neutral side judges are far more rare than you'd think. If you spend enough time in this sport to understand the nuances of a jiu-jitsu match, you've probably built some connections with different teams, and you probably have some strong opinions on the sport. They're out there, but there's no way to really know if they're totally neutral. I would rather the competitors get rewarded for clear-cut positions that you can't argue with over 3 judges giving their philosophical take on what aggression means. Now, you might be thinking, okay, the IBJJF gives the ref power too in the scoring of advantages, and you'd be right. It's inherently necessary to give someone power in the judgment of a match, or you have no judgment. But I'd rather that power be in deciding the lowest value thing, being an advantage, over deciding the highest value thing and deciding the entire fate of the match. Thank you for watching. I appreciate the support. I'm genuinely curious to see what other people think about these rule sets, so let me know down in the comment section if you agree, disagree. If you want to help the channel grow, a like, subscribe, all that good stuff, it really helps, and I'll see you guys on the next one.